Before I start introducing our guest speakers, the first guest speaker I have had some previous relationships with, although predominantly with his wife. My company, did some work for he and his wife in their new home when they first moved here, supposedly in retirement. And they renovated a beautiful home on Long Hill Street. Our firm was one of the firms that did some work in their home, and subsequent to the completion of all of that work, Mark and his wife were extremely gracious and invited all of the tradespeople to their home for an incredible party hosted by them very graciously. I can tell you that it's never happened. I've been in business for 30 years. It has never happened before. Perhaps my husband and I might have been invited, but never were all my men invited. And that was just an example of what a good and kind man he and his wife are. So just wanted to make that comment. So many of you here are longtime members of the World Affairs Council, unlike my husband and I. So much of the information I may be sharing with you, you already know. But for those of you who are newer, this is sort of an introduction to Mark and his long list of accomplishments in world affairs. Mark Hambley is a longtime member and friend of the World Affairs Council, and we are all very grateful to him today for creating this remarkable opportunity. A veteran of more than 30 years in the U.S. diplomatic service, Ambassador Mark Hambley served in 11 postings in 9 Middle Eastern countries, including as U.S. Ambassador in Qatar and later in Lebanon, and as the U.S. Consul General in both Alexandria, Egypt, and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He was designated the Special Representative to the UN Commission on Sustainable Development as the U.S. representative to the Intergovernmental Panel on Forests and as the Special Negotiator on Climate Change during the Clinton and Bush administrations. Following 9/11, as he served as the political advisor to the commander of the U.S. Air Force deployment in the Middle East during the conflict against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan throughout the fall of that year. He was then appointed as director of the Media Outreach Center in London in 2003. This is a specialized unit established under the authority of the U.S. Congress in early 2003. The goal of this center is to improve dialogue with the pan-Arab media and to monitor the programming and coverage of various pan-Arab newspapers and satellite television. In early 2005, he became a senior trustee of the Next Century Foundation. This is when he came out of retirement. Our second speaker today is William Morris. He's, I believe, been in front of you before and shared his views on a variety of topics. Mr. Morris is a former journalist and publisher and an expert on Arab affairs with close family connections with the Arab world. He started his career as a publisher in the late 60s, founding a number of publications. He left publishing in the early 80s to set up a sheep farm in South Wales and became a volunteer prison visitor at the Swansea prison. He was then elected as a city councilor for the West Glamorgan County Council and served on the Public Protection Committee. Then he made a change in plans. William Morris subsequently then worked as a special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Sultanate of Oman, in which capacity he lived and worked in the Sultanate for 6 years from 1991 to 1996. In this role, he advised the Deputy Premier on a range of issues, particularly with regard to launching a series of academic journals at Oman's newly established university. In 1991, he was appointed Secretary General of the Next Century Foundation, which operates in various conflict zones across the globe. Originally established in 1990 to provide a forum for off-the-record discussions between Palestinians and Israelis, the organization has expanded its scope of operations by focusing on and operating in Iraq, Kashmir, Kosovo, Sudan, Egypt, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Libya. I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming both Mark Hambley and William Morris today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth, for your warm introduction. Much appreciated by both of us. Certainly, I'm very pleased that William's here with us today. He is an extraordinary person. I think one of the real humanitarians of the world, someone who has devoted his life to trying to bring together people who are in conflict into zones of peace. And I think certainly the Middle East is an area which certainly demands individuals of his caliber to work on those issues. And I hope as we discuss Syria, you can get a little indication of what the NCF is all about. But I thought today what we do is, in our talk about Syria, first just very briefly to go over a little bit of the geography. You all have some maps on your table of Syria. You know, I love maps. I know you can't see this one up here, but I'll point things on here so we get a little bit of what we're talking about when we talk about Syria, about the nature of the country, the diversity, why it's become a sectarian conflict. And then I'll turn it over to William to make some very pertinent comments about the situation in Syria. I might then follow up with a couple additional points, then we'll open it up for questions. I think for the best way for a discussion of this nature is to leave a lot of time available for questions from the audience. So that's what we'll do if that's okay with you. But look at Syria here. It looks like a big blob on the map. Turkey to the north, Iraq over here to the east, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan down here around the other sides of the country, the Mediterranean Sea over here. It's a country about 185,000 square kilometers. That translates into about 71,000 square miles, about the size of the state of Washington, or more close to about the size of Pennsylvania and New York combined. Population of any Middle Eastern country is very difficult because they haven't had any censuses for many years. But from extrapolations to everything, everybody believes the population of Syria is around 23 million people, of whom about 74% are Muslim, Sunni Muslims, 13% are Shiite and Alawites, around 10%, maybe 8%, figures aren't really quite, depends who you talk to, are Christian, and then you have Druze, about 3.2, 3.3% of the population. But you have, as a result, many minority groups as well. You do have the Kurds, who are largely in this part of the country, but scattered throughout the area. Unlike in neighboring Iraq, where the bulk of the Kurds are up in these three northern governments, in Syria they're a little more dispersed. But nonetheless, they're in 8 districts over here, and they have indeed focused, taken advantage of their situation of this war, and formed their own sort of autonomous little government up there in 8 different districts. But that's only because of conflicts that have been brought to them by the Islamist groups who moved into the area. But your cities here are largest ones. Syria is really a very urbanized country. Only 1/4 of the country is arable. And that is decreasing rapidly. The Euphrates River passes through Syria, but that has been dammed by Turkey, and is causing great difficulties in both Syria and Iraq in terms of their ability to irrigate fields. That's one of the reasons for this whole Arab Spring issue in Syria, is because of the drought over the past 6 years has forced even more people into the cities. About half the population was in the 2 cities of Aleppo and Damascus. Both had around 6 million people in them, about 12 million people. Aleppo being slightly larger. Aleppo's up here. Damascus is way down here. The main road goes up not far from the Lebanese border. You have Homs and Hama up here. These are the 2 large cities we have heard a lot about in the news. Homs is the larger of the 2. City of what the beginning of the war was a little over 1 million people. It's largely now been depopulated. You have a huge effort going in to try to relieve the remaining Sunnis who are in the middle of the city. William will talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And then we have Hama, which is still under rebel control. And you have then all these other areas which are dispersed between. There's no real one area where the government is in control and the rebels are out of control. There's, for instance, over here in the far east, in Raqqa and down Deir el-Zawar, both cities about 250,000 people. Both those have passed back and forth between Islamist groups and the government. So at the moment in Deir ez-Zor, you have Islamist groups in the mountains outside the city. In the city at the moment, the government has taken over, but that switches back and forth considerably. So on that note, I'll stop for a minute and turn over to William, and then I'll come back a little bit later.
Well, thank you, Mark. I should hold this up, or is this louder? Should I use yours? There we go. Yes, I wanted to talk about a couple of issues. The chemical weapons attack is history, but I thought I'd just go back to it because might be useful for everybody here to understand how difficult it is to understand what's going on in Syria. You'll remember the seminal weapons attack in Damascus in August 2013. It's been all over the news internationally. As to the best of our knowledge, what happened was that, it happened the day the weapons inspectors came to Damascus, which makes it very odd. But it would seem to us that what happened was that the government had surrounded this area of Damascus where the rebels were holed out, and they took a number of prisoners, about 26 in number, young men, and they sent one of them back to the rebel fighters there and said, surrender. And the government's offering you the chance of staying alive if you surrender. And the guys there said no, and it would seem to us, with the best of our information, that the attack was by the government. So far, so what? Well, so good, I don't know, but the attack took place. Curious thing was that the casualties of that attack were 394 dead, of whom 214 were men, 2 were women, and 144 were children. That doesn't exactly gel with the US government figure of over 1,400 dead, but that was perhaps put out for more political reasons. The most credible sources put the level of dead at that kind. The VDC puts it at 588. The French intelligence puts it at 281. But we've certainly had interns working and looking at all available sources, and we would say that there were about just under 400 dead in that attack. The reason the low number of women were killed, and by the way, that figures 214 to 144 doesn't add up to 394. There were some bodies that was difficult to tell whether they were men or women from the video evidence available. But the reason, as best we can tell, is the government attacked an area where there were rebel fighters, and then the chemicals spread into nearby areas, and in the nearby areas, it was children who were more susceptible. So young men were killed who were rebel fighters, and as the chemical diffused, children were killed, and adults weren't killed in the perimeter of the area under a chemical attack. What is curious or interesting, to me anyway, is the subsequent UN report, and that's there for anybody who's interested to look at. It's probably one of the most amateurish documents that you would see in international affairs. It's a wonder they got away with it. It's largely, a lot of the information is redacted. They looked at 5 rockets and put down the bearing, the azimuth, the caliber of the rockets, the location. There was no actual GPS or for location for any of the rockets they found. They redacted that information, and it makes a considerable difference as to where they were fired from. They had 5 rockets, one of which had chemical weapons, evidence of chemical weapons in it, and the other 4 had none. But they redacted the information. They took out the information in the report on the bearing for 3 of the rockets, on the caliber of the weapons for 3 of the rockets, and they even took out the on 2 of the rockets. They took out the information as to what area at all the rockets were found in. Now, why is this interesting? Well, they had problems, as best we can tell, in getting credible evidence to support the reality, which was the fact that the government fired the weapons. So they put together a staggeringly shoddy report, and it was accepted by the international community. They are, after all, by and large, the UN chemical weapons inspectors tend to be quite amateurish. They're not chemical weapons experts as you would know them, because most, even in Hans Blix's day, and we used to have a lot of liaison with them, most of them are seconded from the intelligence communities of the world. So a government will second 2 from this country, 2 from that country, 2 from this country. But they'll tend to second intelligence people because that's more useful to them. So these units don't tend to contain real professionals, hence the nature of these reports. Now, I thought I'd mention that to you. I also thought I would actually say something about the, more generally, the casualty situation. In January of this year, there were 3,000, the last month we got available data that we've managed to compile, 3,300 people, 3,300 people killed, 3,301 in Syria, as opposed to January of last year when there were 5,631 killed. This January, 2,048 of those were civilians in the month of January. January last year, it was 2,523 civilians killed. That bucks the general trend. The general trend is civilian numbers of dead are down. Why is that happening in general? Because most of the major cities are being depopulated and people are becoming refugees, so there aren't as many civilians around to get killed as there were in collateral damage and so forth. The rebel dead, January this year, 609. January 2013, 1,896. Government dead, January this year, 644. January 2013 was 1,212. We have an ongoing war of attrition, a real civil war, in which people are brutal. They're killing each other ruthlessly, and no prisoners are taken. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 for the cameras, but by and large, the government kill all their prisoners, and the rebels kill all their prisoners. This is a civil war. The Libyan civil war was not dissimilar. They are staggeringly brutal things. So that's the situation. And of course, you have refugees. There are large numbers of refugees, some over 3.5 million, according to the UN. It's hard to know how they get these figures because it's hard to estimate numbers. Some of the UN figures are almost seem like they're plucked out of the air. They say that there have been 10,000 children killed in Syria since the beginning of the war. I would imagine the figure was much higher. And the international community has pledged $2.5 billion on the 15th of January in a meeting in Kuwait. The international community pledged £2.5 billion $2.5 billion, beg your pardon, in humanitarian relief. Most of this money actually never goes there. That doesn't happen. I mean, there's not going to be $2.5 billion spent on looking after refugees in Syria. These are pledges that don't get honored by and large. The camps, some of them are better than others. Many of these refugees are living in atrocious conditions. Camps in Turkey are notoriously bad, shamefully bad, and have been since the outset. Most of them are in Lebanon, a significant number in Jordan. And the country is, as we see it, a pretty horrifying situation. Given all of this that's going on, what hope is there? Well, there's a lot of hope, actually, I think. We have the Geneva process for what it's worth. It's with a small faction of the opposition. It's not with opposition that have any control on the ground. Obviously, the big fighters, al-Nusra Front, the great Islamist fighters who do all the fighting and all the killing on behalf of the rebels, are not represented at all, nor are ISIS, the other major group that are fighting, nor, to be honest, are the Free Syrian Army, really, who have a little leverage still, although they're dwindling in power. So you have a small faction in the Syrian National Coalition being represented on behalf of who? On behalf of elements of the Syrian expatriates, really. But doesn't matter, there's some sort of negotiation taking place, and that process, I think, will, or everybody hopes and thinks it will continue. Is it going to make a difference? Well, it is. The Saudis are beginning to back the idea of a military council to take on the power of the in the transition period, to take on the power of the presidency. And with Saudi backing, and remember that Saudis are the main push behind many of the rebel fighters, financially anyway, though there's a lot of Kuwaiti funding from private individuals and others. Well, there's funding from across the Arab world. But with Saudi backing for some form of outcome that brings an end to this fighting, we have some sort of hope. We have the beginnings of hope of an end to this catastrophic war. Of course, we're never going to get anywhere unless we have Iran on board, because the Russians are fairly easy about whether Bashar stays or Bashar goes, but Iran are the real people who dig their heels in as far as Bashar al-Assad is concerned. The Iranians are getting more pragmatic, a little more pragmatic, and our latest conversations with the Iranians seem to imply, in fact, they stated quite clearly the last time we met them, that they would like discussions with the Saudis, if they can have direct discussions with the Saudis on this issue, and if the Saudis assure them that they do not want to take control of Syria. And remember, the cross-border tribes are considerable. There's a lot of Saudis regard Syria as Greater Saudi Arabia or whatever. It's one of their ambitions, or unstated ambitions in my view. Mark, who's a great Saudi buff, will correct me. But if Saudi Arabia doesn't want to take control of Syria, then the Iranians say they might shift to a policy that was much like Russia's policy. They are willing to see the opposition have a share in government. They're willing to see a new constitution. And they say that, I mean, privately this is, they say that it's not about a single person. They don't care whether it's Bashar al-Assad. They are even, they say, they are even willing to support democracy. So this is where the Iranians are coming from. But their bottom line is that they want to keep their influence and to keep Syria under their hegemony. And there are odd other aspects to this whole thing. The Syrian establishment, when you talk to them, I mean, they come out with some crazy ideas about who should succeed Bashar al-Assad. They talk about people like Bushayna Shaban, the rather odd lady who was Minister for Expatriates, and they talk about people like Maher al-Assad, the notorious brother of Bashar al-Assad, who are obviously not credible figures to succeed the present incumbent. The elections, by the way, are due in May 10th, 2014, May 10th this year. They will obviously be delayed, but it's interesting that the president's official mandate comes due for renewal at that point. And they also, but the Syrian establishment do accept that there could be figures who are opposition who might be president of Syria. And you wouldn't think that, but they speak quite fondly of Sheikh Ahmed Moaz al-Khatib, who was the former head of the Syrian National Coalition, who resigned in a huff when he didn't like the man who was appointed for the Prime Ministerial Council in exile. Anyway, they are surprisingly accommodating. So I think there are possibilities of peace. There are real, genuine possibilities of peace. What we need now is a clear lead from the international community. The international community need to bully Iran in the nicest possible way and not make vast concessions in terms of in terms of nuclear facilities and so forth without getting some payback. The international community, and America in particular, needs to start taking a lead and rather having merely a reactive policy. This happens, we react. This happens, we react. We need some real drive. So there we are. That's enough from me. I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, William. You opened quite a few cans, which we can, not cans of worms, just a few cans. We can explore that later. I just want to say a few words about a topic which was alluded to by William, which I think is very important for us here today. Namely, what can we do as the United States? Our policy thus far has been one of a successive string of Hail Mary passes which has failed. We not only didn't lead from behind, we didn't lead from the second row on this particular issue, and the result has been disastrous for Syria and indeed for the region as a whole. But what can we do? I think there are four basic issues, I think, which we could discuss briefly. I think the first one is in the role of being the humanitarian leader. This is something the United States does very, very well when we put our mind to it. I don't mean just by having USAID out there with a few parcels and teams going to study health and safety in various camps. We need to have a very well organized, put a general like General J. Garner, who did so well in northern Iraq after the first Gulf War in 1991, 92, to organize a very, very good, strong humanitarian effort on the part of the U.S. to ensure that every refugee gets blankets, gets tents that's overseas. We shouldn't leave it to the international community to do this alone. We should get in there and put some boots on the ground outside Syria to ensure that the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people who've been forced out of the country have been given appropriate support. We should also take full advantage of the UN Security Council's resolution last Saturday, which mandates that there has to be humanitarian corridors to all besieged areas of Syria in order to give assistance to people that are suffering. And this has got to be done in a better way than it's being done at the moment. William didn't mention it, and I thought he would, about the situation that's going on with the relief of Hama, where you have the only people left are Sunnis in the old city, and of course when they're brought out, the men are all taken one way, and some are not seen again, and some are released. But basically we are participating in almost a genocide of the Sunni population of that city, of Homs, of that city, which is something which I think we want to prevent. We've got to have much more organized effort. This will be reviewed after 30 days. We'll probably find that neither side in Syria, the opposition or the government, is being particularly compliant. We've got to make sure that we take advantage of the fact that this was a unanimous resolution of the Security Council, get the Russians and others to put some teeth in it and to get a way in which we can really get some assistance to the people of Syria who are in such great need. 1/3 of the Syrian population, 7 million, are estimated to have been displaced. 3 million outside the borders, the rest inside the country. It's an unbelievable situation, and I think it's something we have to try and do something about. The second aspect, one William has mentioned, is that we may still remain wary about giving arms to the Syrian opposition, given the inclination of the Islamists to take those arms and to use them. But I think we should be organizing much stronger effort with our allies, the Turks, particularly the Saudis, the Qataris, and others, to ensure that they are organizing their assistance to groups which support our overall ends in Syria, which are to have a moderate government replace Bashar al-Assad. And I think this is something which, frankly, we finally decided we're going to do. The Saudis have come to their own epiphany on this. Bandar bin Sultan has been removed as being the point person in terms of Saudi dealings with the Syrians. He was the one who led the effort to arm all these Islamist groups. The Saudis and Qataris denied they gave arms to these groups, which are so inimical to all of our interests. but in fact they did. And these groups, we have three of them basically of the Nusra Front. You have the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, and you have the Ahrar al-Sham. These three groups are the ones who are leading the fighting and creating so much chaos and damage. They go into a village, they just don't take over a village. They take out everyone who is not a Sunni Muslim and either decapitates them, they do horrific things to these people. They cause remainder to flee. And they have imposed Sharia law on several of these large towns they've seized in the east, and they take it out very literally. Many of them go in from one group, go in without shoes because they don't want to wear shoes to meet the Prophet, because they assume they're all going to die, and this is part of their legs. They wear little amulets around their necks, giving them access to heaven when they are killed in action. So these are groups which have got to be eliminated, and we have to find a way to work with our Saudi and Qatarese associates to try and do that. We are reorganizing the Free Syrian Army. There was a meeting in Washington last week. I read David Ignatius' article in the newspaper today, published yesterday. It was repeated twice. The Free Syrian Army has been reorganized, and the process of being reorganized. The former head, Salim Idris, very nice man, but not a very competent general, had really no support on the ground within Syria. He's been replaced by another man named Abdullah al-Bashir, who is a recent defector from the Syrian army, came last year. He's from Quneitra, down along the Israeli, in the occupied zone of the Golan Heights. But he lost a son in battle, has a lot more credibility with the Free Syrian Army because of that. And he also has his deputy as a man up in the north in Idlib province who fought to get the ISIS, Islamic radicals, out of his neighboring town in Idlib province. So I think that this is a situation which is very good. The third point I think we want to emphasize is that we should find a way, as William indicated, to ensure the Russians and the Iranians are brought into play. We worked the Russians on the Geneva process. That has not gone too well. I think what happened in Ukraine may indeed have an impact on their willingness to support our efforts in Syria. That's a known factor. Iran is, again, a very difficult issue. As William indicated, the Iranians are suggesting they may be altering their position somewhat. There's strong support of Bashar al-Assad as being president, but that's something which has to be tested. And I think we have to make sure we don't give them too many concessions, but we have to find a way to bring Iran into this process somehow. And the fourth aspect, the final aspect, is I think we should find ways to irritate Bashar al-Assad. And I think you can do this by reaching out to other members of the Alawite community who don't like him. There's Dr. Rifat al-Assad, the former vice president, who has been in exile and doesn't like Bashar, who tried to kill him in the 1990s, I believe, and so has certain misgivings about his nephew. He's been in exile for a number of years, has an opposition group, claims to be the oldest opposition figure in Syria to Bashar. But I think certainly if we gave him some more support, I think that'd give Bashar a little bit of nervousness, which I think is always very useful. We'd hope today to have Siwar al-Assad, one of his very presentable sons, with us. He's going to Washington for a conference where we're all going to appear on Thursday, but a little visa problem. He didn't quite make it to Springfield. But Siwar is one of these people who speaks flawless English, Arabic, and prefers French, because that's where he writes his books. He writes detective stories, which are bestsellers in France. I'll get one for Sheila. She'll enjoy it greatly. But he is a very articulate spokesperson of finding a new Syria, which the Alawites take a different role than they've had up to now. So I just will close with a small remembrance of a lady named Sabra Khalaf. She's the oldest refugee in the world, 107 years of age. She is a Kurdish Yazidi, and the Yazidis are an oppressed minority in the Middle East. William can tell you about them. They're interesting folks who don't eat lettuce, and they have a different view of Lucifer, which creates problems for them between Christians and Muslims, but a fascinating group. We visited their headquarters in Iraq, mostly in Iraq. But this lady, 107 years old, lived in this part of Iraq up here. The ISIS people came in to her village, destroyed the houses, killed a number of people. Her family has largely emigrated many years ago to Germany, and her son came back to take care of her. And because she's been there since born in 1907, And she has seen the Ottoman Empire. She's lived through the revolutions, World War II, the Ba'athists coming in and out, various wars and things. The first time she was forced to leave her home in all this was because of this last conflict this year. And she went by land to Turkey, got on a boat, and paid money, huge amounts of money to get off to a boat, take her to Italy. The boat almost sank. They ended up in Greece, and now she is in Athens, Greece. And all she wants to do is get to her home in Germany. EU papers are such, it probably won't happen for several more months. She's very ill, she's frail. She probably won't make her one dream is to die with her family. And poor Madame Khalaf probably won't have that. But she represents really what is a problem which all of us should focus on. Namely, the nature of a refugee situation, a sectarian issue, of when things get out of control, the humanity which suddenly becomes so threatened, and the whole basis of our life, everything which brings communities together, are suddenly dissolved. And so I think the more that we as Americans, while we don't have to get involved militarily, there are things we can do diplomatically and on the humanitarian side, which I think would certainly ease the situation, perhaps promote an end to this conflict, which is going to go on for several more years. So on that, I think we'll take questions, if we can, Gary, and try to...
Just a couple quick things. One is we have some additional food. If anybody else would like to come up again, please feel free to do so. Number two is I'm not going to necessarily moderate the questions. I'll let Mark and Bill pick whoever they'd like to take the questions from. Sid? Oh, and Sid's going to take this microphone and run around so everybody can hear their questions. So let's make sure that's live, Mark. I think we just have to push that button there. But how about a round of applause, huh? So that being said, I will turn this over to Sid. Sid.
Please. Here.
The question is, clearly after listening to both of you, one could be totally and absolutely uncontrollably frustrated and wonder how in the world you can take Humpty Dumpty and put it back together again. And the chaos that we see in the press, from the press, is just beyond imagination. And it seems to me that you have on one side a government, originally a government, that is without any restrictions or controls, rearmed on a consistent basis by the Russians and the Iranians. On the other side, we have the rebels, where the United States is in absolute fear that surface-to-air missiles will wind up in the wrong hands and eventually will get out of the country and could literally harm all our commercial airlines everywhere in the world. So how can you restore a military balance, which I think is necessary in order to have any viable and credible peace talks? How do you do it?
I think this is one of the reasons why these talks last week in Washington were so important. We have focused on the Free Syria Army as being the base. They need strong leadership. That leadership is now hopefully being provided by these new folks that have come in. They've met with Mr. Al-Jaraba, who is the head of the Syrian National Coalition, which is the overall very, very disparate body of one group of Syrian opposition. But this, hopefully they will be able to mobilize people. We're also starting to train Syrian army people. In Jordan, we've had a base there for the last 9 months. We only train 250 people a month. That has to be doubled or tripled. And the Saudis have urged that on us. One important aspect of this whole thing is President Obama, as you know, is going to Saudi Arabia next month. This is a surprise. He was going originally to Belgium, Netherlands, and to Rome to meet the Pope. But now he's going to Saudi Arabia. That's a critical visit. There are a lot of it. The Saudis are angry with us over Egypt, over Iran, over Syria. And now that they've changed their own position on Syria, brought in this new Mohammed bin Nayef, who's the Minister of Interior, a very, very solid member of the Saudi establishment. He, I think, will be a lot more focused on the Syrian issue. I think be a lot more convincing to the president and his team about what we can do and how we work together with the Saudis to try and build a team, basically starting from scratch, build a team which has proper armament, not necessarily man-pads, but proper armament which can hopefully push back the government forces. Want to say that one?
Well, yes. I mean, Syria is awash with weapons, and you only have to go on YouTube and look at a group like Arar al-Sham that Mark mentioned, and you'll see their vast lorries and they're unwrapping sparkling new missiles, some of which, the caliber of which, look like the size of this table. I mean, they're immense rockets in the hands of the opposition. Quite staggering, the amount of money that's being thrown at groups like the Al-Nusra Front. Their boys walk into a chemist shop in Aleppo to buy some paracetamol or something, and they give the guy a $100 bill and say, keep the change. I mean, and that's the norm. They are throwing money around. They are rolling in money from the Gulf, from the Gulf businessmen who feel that it's their duty and their conscience to throw money at the Syrian war. Or the people who are not getting arms really are the secular, if you like, the secular fighters. And they're not doing that much of the fighting. So the Free Syrian Army, if you like to call them that, are the people who don't have weapons on the same scale and don't have the same commitment to fight and die. The Alawites are committed to fighting and dying, and so are the Islamists. And these are the people that are fighting. So you have a difficult situation. I think the diplomatic way out is the best way out, and I think there is a chance for it. The Iranians curiously say that, okay, but if we do change the president, the fighting will go on. We're talking years here. And they may be right, but if we change the president and we have some sort of new constitution in Syria, there is the beginning of an end to this terrible civil war, and that's what we want to see.
Over here, please.
Thank you for the informative and enlightening session. There's something that I didn't hear anything about. In June, I understood there was a timeline for the removal of chemical weapons. Isn't this a possible conflict with what Congress has talked about? What's the status of that?
Well, the weapons, there isn't been a delay in terms of their removal from the various sites to Latakia, put on ships, Danish and Norwegian, I think, for their destruction. Some have been destroyed in Syria itself. That is partially, the government says we can't because they have to go through rebel areas, and we have to clear those areas. Partially that's acceptable because it's a very tricky road. You know, the road is open one day and next day it's closed, so they have to make sure these don't fall into the wrong hands. But partly also it's on the part of the Syrian government, a little bit of, you know, pushback. We have to make sure that that doesn't become too delayed. This is a key thing for us. And I think we will, we've upped the ante a bit. Whether we actually follow through on taking out sanctions against the Syrians in terms of punitive measure, I don't know. But it's something we certainly monitor very carefully.
So that date will be modified?
I think it will be. It'll have to be, I think.
Yes. And obviously some chemical weapons are actually in areas that are totally controlled by the opposition. So it is very difficult, but they...
The largest storage place was a base northwest of Aleppo. That was taken over by the opposition very early on in 2012. And a lot of weapons went then. And it was reoccupied by the government last year, but there were no weapons to be found there. So there are some which are not in hands, this is why you don't know what happened at that chemical weapons issue back in August. I think the jury's still out 100%. Please.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if, I remember reading in an old book by Jimmy Carter that Bashir al-Assad was a reasonable person you could work with, or is he now in the top 10 list of evil dictators in the world? In other words, what's really driving him, and who is he really?
Bashar is like father, like son. The family are, he went off to be an ophthalmologist in the UK. He was not the anointed one to become president. Basil, the son of Hafiz, was to be the son that was supposed to do that. Very different character. He died in a racing car incident. He was racing his car too fast and rolled off the road. But when he came in, there were a lot of hopes that he would change things. He married a very beautiful British gal of Syrian extraction, and had a couple daughters. I think. There was about 6 months of sort of a Damascus Spring in 2000, but that then was kiboshed. I think basically if you look at his background, he did lead gangs to try and shoot other members of the family, like Raif al-Assad, on his father's instructions. He's got a very nasty streak to him, obviously. I wouldn't want him to work in my eyes at all, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they are quite a extraordinary family. The wasn't it the sister Bushra? The husband, her husband was killed, and it was always said that he was killed in a rebel bombing, but in fact, he was almost certainly killed by the family because he was a threat, you know, as far as a possible coup taking place. They're like a bit like the Borgias, which is why they're actually quite afraid of their own family members. It's interesting that is a greater fear possibly than the fear of the rebels, because Bashar al-Assad is very proud, and he's not going to run away, by the way, just to be clear. He's not going to, if you offer him safe haven somewhere, I don't think he's going to run. What dictator? There have been examples, the guy in Yemen and so on, but it's pretty rare that a dictator cuts and run. They usually stay till the last ditch because they're so proud, and they're not going to go. They're going to stay. He's, I think, cut from that cloth. He will stay and fight to the end. But he might be persuaded to step down with pressure from his own community, with pressure from Iran, and with pressure from Russia. And that's what we want to see. And that's, I believe, a real possibility.
I think Yemen might actually offer Abdel Saleh, the president of Yemen, not a nice man, not a really evil person, but very much of a dictator in his own right, did step down. He's in Yemen as a free citizen. He's exonerated for his crimes. I don't think Bashar will be exonerated for his crimes. I don't think that's why I don't think he will be allowed to live in Latakia by himself, safe and sound. But I think, as William indicates, I don't think he's going to be like Ben Ali or Idi Amin and go off to Saudi Arabia. He certainly would not be welcome in Saudi Arabia in any case. Ken.
Given all the complexities that we hear you talk about, can you give us a sense of your confidence that the U.S. government will find the right people and give the right support so that we can provide some leadership, which probably is essential to making Syria become, or to diffuse the Syrian situation? Do you have confidence that this will come about and that we're heading that way? Because there might be things that are not quite in the news yet.
By the nature of my former career, I have to be an optimist. I look at the glass always being half full rather than half empty. But I think given the past performance of this administration on a whole range of foreign policy issues, I think that's an open question. I think in terms of Syria, one of the untold stories, one which will have to be relayed at one point by someone better than myself, goes as to why our policy early on was so botched in Syria. It certainly was not Hillary Clinton's fault. She and the State Department organized a rather rational, no boots on the ground sort of an approach in which we would offer military assistance going through the Saudis and gutteries that we closely monitor, very much like we're trying to do now. And that was scotched by elements within the White House, not the ones in the NSC, which are on board, but other political elements in the White House. I could name some names, actually I'll give you a couple, but you'd be astounded at the way some of these politicos felt themselves empowered because of their position of proximity to the president to interfere in the affairs of government. Bill Gates has, in his book, I didn't like it very much, but he does talk a bit about interference from the White House in terms of carrying out day-to-day DoD policy. And he was largely complaining about the NSC. A book could also be written about the interference from politicos in the White House, which business really is domestic politics, but trying to protect the president from those neo-isolationists in the Democratic Party who do not want to see us getting anywhere, shape, or form involved anymore overseas misadventures, and trying to take that as being their right in order to eliminate a progressive policy on Syria, which Hillary Clinton had tried to work out. Now, John Kerry has come in and has once more resurrected the ban and said we have to be involved. And to his credit, I'm not a great fan of John Kerry, but I give him a lot of credit since he's been secretary at going against the grain, against what the inclination is of many people in the White House, and saying we must try and find a resolution to the problem of the Middle East and Arab-Israeli. We must do something about doing something with Libya. We must do something about Syria. And I give him a lot of credit for that. And I think perhaps with his support, we might indeed find a way which we can move this new policy forward in a way which would be advantageous to Syria and to ourselves and to the region.
Yes, one small footnote. I do think that the U.S. government and the British government, indeed, should speak to all the parties involved as far as the various opposition movements are concerned. We tend to speak to only our favorite people, and they tend to be the Islamists, and at least the secular groups. Many of the secular groups are left out of discussion, and certainly left out of the talks in Geneva. You can understand the willingness or the desire to have one delegation representing the opposition, but I mean, the Kurdish groups should have been there, for instance, and they wanted to be there, and they were not accepted because they weren't part of the Syrian National Coalition. So we need to broaden out our thinking if we want to move things forward.
Back to the room way over there, please.
Mr. Ambassador, something that strikes me as strange, I'm an old Foreign Service officer myself. The thing that strikes me as strange, it would seem to me in the Russian national interest to show leadership and resolve this problem much better than the United States is resolving it. We know the prestige they won. Sochi, we saw what they spent on that. And there's something very cheap for them in terms of relations with Europe and with the rest of the world to bring leadership to solve this problem. Why isn't that happening? I don't see any downsides for them. Why aren't we working through them to get this done?
Well, I think the implication question is the Russians have had, I mean, my own reading is, the Russians have had a better policy on this issue than we have. Because they've said, look, we may not want to have Bashar al-Assad in office, but you remove him, who's to take his place? There's a vacuum. You'll have the same situation you've had in Iraq, in Libya, and other places where if you don't have an end game all organized, you're going to have chaos. That's why they've continued to support Bashar al-Assad, but they've made indications that, you know, if we had a better game plan, we aren't wedded to Bashar al-Assad. We don't want him to die. We'll offer him safe haven in Moscow, have a dacha down a lot of places in Sochi now he could live if he wanted to. We got a whole new stadium, you know, Bashar al-Assad Iceberg Stadium or something, you know, but whatever. But I agree. Hopefully we'll have a dialogue with the Russians. It was quite good leading up to Geneva 2. At Geneva 2, it was not quite as progressive. The Russians do talk to more people than we do. They talk to anyone is invited to within their grace their table. They talk to Rafat al-Assad, really very quietly, now very publicly. And this is despite the fact that Bashar al-Assad looks at, what are you doing? I mean, you can't talk to this guy. But they do it because they, in some ways, have are better focused on the Syrian situation than we do. And they do have an embassy in Damascus. We do not. Please.
Can you comment on the role of the Christians with Assad? Because I understand that they like him, because he's always been so good to the Christians.
Yeah. The question was, what about the role of the Christians? That they like Assad, and why do they support him? I think the question whether they like Assad or not is probably not the case. I don't think many.
I heard this from an Armenian who has a mother there.
Yeah, I'm sure she looks to Assad and the Alawite government as protecting them from what they see as the unknown factor of another government, particularly when you have these groups like Nusra Front, Ahrar Sham, and ISI that went into Malula, the oldest Christian settlements in the world, where they still speak Aramaic, the language of Lord Jesus Christ, and burned the place and attacked at the moment. They're up in the mountain still. And these wonderful pictures of old Christian men coming to defend the place and to force them out. And this is something which is terrifying to Christians. But maybe there are about 2 million Christians in Syria in 2011. I'd say maybe it's only 250,000 now. I think most of them, certainly they're out of their homes. They've been displaced. Many of them are in refugee camps. The wealthier have moved overseas to Europe and the United States and other places wherever they have friends and relatives. I think we may also be seeing the death of yet another Christian community in the Middle East. That's one of the great tragedies of Syria. It happened in Iraq. It's happening in the Palestinian areas. It may happen in Egypt. But this is one of the great tragedies that we've got to try some way to try to reverse before we can. But I think that they look at Bashar as being the only one that they can survive under. They want to see what happens. Get a different group in, which offers to protect all groups and can improve by having peacekeepers on the ground, give enough security, I think you'll have much more, they certainly won't support Bashar to the end.
Yes, Syria has obviously has 2 years conscription for all young men, but the professional army is predominantly Alawite, Christian, and Druze, the long-term serving army. And the Christians do, I mean, obviously, they're not wedded to Bashar al-Assad, but they are wedded to they're frightened to death of al-Nusra Front, the Islamists, and indeed they're even scared stiff of the kind of people we're backing in the Syrian National Coalition, who tend also to be of an Islamist inclination. So they really feel they have nowhere to stand but to stand with Bashar. Most of the minorities feel, I mean, Druze, the Yazidis, all these little groups, these many small groups, certainly the Alawites, feel there's nowhere to stand but to stand with Bashar al-Assad. That's why this is a full-blooded civil war. I mean, they are fighting on his side because they have no ownership of the future that we are building for them if the more Islamist groups are going to take over Syria. That's their worry.
Okay.
Last question?
Yep, you got one more.
One last question. Back there, please, yes.
Israel's giving some limited medical help, I think, on the border. But how vulnerable is Israel now with the Islamic groups that have taken over in Syria?
Well, they're not vulnerable yet, but indeed, if an Islamic government takes over in Syria, they'll be very vulnerable. They won't just have Hezbollah and Lebanon to worry about with all those missiles. They'll soon have a whole different nature of a problem. But Israel has been very generous in terms of allowing injured Syrians to come down through the Golan Heights and given treatment. And then they go back, and there's a continuing stream coming and going. It's a very impressive operation done with Israeli efficiency and with a lot of good feelings generated because of that. This is why if we want to have good feelings ourselves generated about the U.S., which has, as you know, a single-digit popularity figures, if we're in the camps starting there and again get medical assistance, get teams in there, we can make a real difference and start to turn around the impression of the United States as being party to all these negative elements, when in fact we should be associated with the angels in this.
May I have a round of applause for our guest speakers, please?